Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Ukraine war front, no it's not, news update for the 6th of October 2023. Let's get straight into where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. The usual caveats apply. You can find them in my description to this video below. I think this is a significant day of losses for the Russians. Now, we are seeing 620 personnel lost. That is considerably higher than we have experienced or we've seen for the last month. We have had a couple of days during the entire counteroffensive where the loss figures have been up to 1,000. But really, those figures are mainly associated with the Bakhmut activities and the height of the engagements there, where there was kind of meat attacks, these waves of convicts that were sent against the Ukrainians. There were huge losses for the Russians, even though they were making progress. And of course, Avdiivka, that was sometimes forgotten, not reported as much as Bakhmut, but actually was really heavy in terms of casualties for both sides. But there we are seeing 1,000 being lost a day. We haven't really seen that other than a couple of days of spiked activity during this counteroffensive. And where it's been for the last few weeks has been the 3 to 4, possibly 500, and now it's up to 620, and that is supported by high numbers, very high numbers of armor loss as well. So it's not necessarily, as I always say, it's not necessarily about the numbers, like whether it's 620 or 640 or whatever. It's not really that important, but it's about the story this tells us. It's about the trends that we see. And I think we've seen a trend upwards in the last few days because I think there is a lot of activity going on in certain places. And I think the Russians are pushing back themselves. So there are counterattack. The Russian form of defense at the moment appears to be counterattack as soon as they lose ground, so that they are, I don't know whether it's a PR thing, a doctrinal thing, a tactical thing, but they seem to not want to lose ground and they attack back really strongly once they've done that. We've seen this around Bakhmut a lot. We've seen it already all over the front lines where there is significant activity. And in doing so, they are going to trick their own forces. So yes, they stop the Ukrainians from moving forward, so they can, they can say to their domestic audience, look how much the Ukrainian army hasn't moved in their whole counteroffensive. And then people even like myself saying, yeah, it's culminated or it's not going territorial as well as the Ukrainians would like. On the other hand, there are other metrics of success. And one of the metrics is the attrition of the Russian forces, and the Russian forces are getting seriously attrited in order to stop the Ukrainians from advancing. And this is because they are throwing everything and the kitchen sink at certain areas like the Robotyne sector. We have seen as well in the last few days activity in Makivka. Makivka is between Kreminna and Svatova on the front line. It's an area that has traditionally seen quite a lot of activity during, I guess, the heights of where we saw a lot of activity on this axis. So you have if you remember Chervona Popivka, Ploshchanka, those kind of areas, and just north of there, Nevska and Makivka, lots of activity towards there, and then you start getting onto further up towards Svatova and Makivka and all these other places, Persho-Travnevi here, Ryarodka, Novahirivka, activity where there is now. But Makivka's been quite quiet since the height of this, the activities in this sector, or this axis. Over the last few days, it has really heated up. There have been claims of quite a lot of losses for the Russians, I think, in terms of equipment. So this could explain some of those high loss figures that we're just going to talk about. Ukrainian General Staff reported on October the 4th that Ukrainian forces repelled 5 Russian attacks in Makivka. So, you can go and look at lots of equipment being blown up by Stugners and whatever. Makivka is an area of quite a lot of activity, and that could also explain these higher numbers. So these higher numbers are more likely Russian attacks, and I said this yesterday, than Ukrainian attacks. When the Russians lose a lot of mechanized equipment, it's usually them sending it in for attacks that are foiled, and they lose an awful lot in one fell swoop. Or perhaps yesterday in a number of fell swoops, or this might cover the last couple of days. It doesn't necessarily mean all these figures are from the last 24 hours. There'll be submissions of evidence to the General Staff. There is a bit of a protocol from what I can understand as to how these figures get totted up. So anyway, The Russians have lost 20 tanks and 30 APVs, armored personnel vehicles. That is a staggeringly large number of vehicles to lose in one single day. Now, again, even if you take 20% off these are bad numbers. Even if you take 30% off these are bad numbers. So the Ukrainians have done a good job, it appears, of attriting the Russian forces. Remember, there are different metrics for success. The territorial gain metric isn't as important as these other metrics at the moment. I've talked about this many times. You have the one overall objective, we need to take our territory back, but that comes after you do all these sub-objectives below that. And once you've achieved them, then you can walk in and take territory. So trying to do that, taking territory, without doing the attrition first, is what happened over the last 3 months with the Ukrainians, really. They're going to lose troops in the Robotyne area if they don't spend a lot of time doing what their air force would have done if they had air supremacy, which is to attrit the Russian air defenses, the Russian artillery, the Russian armor. And that's what they're doing now. And this is being very successful. So on the one hand, we can be negative about the lack of territory that the Ukrainians have gained, but we can be exceptionally positive about the fact that the Black Sea Fleet has done a runner from Sevastopol, which is the whole reason this war exists, right? We probably need to talk about that more. The fact that Russia has had to remove most of their Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol. Well, that's massive. Okay, but also you look at these figures. These are very positive for the Ukrainians. Right, 23 artillery systems, maybe half of what we saw yesterday, but that is still a massive loss for the for the Russians. I have seen oodles of footage over the last actually 2 or 3 days of stuff getting destroyed by HIMARS, cluster munitions, drones, precision guided munitions like Excalibur rounds, and just general artillery, counter battery fire. I've seen tanks. I've seen self-propelled guns. This morning, I've seen towed artillery systems, D-30s, getting taken out by this kind of stuff. So there's plenty of footage out there if you want to go and find it to support these numbers. 29 drones, that's going to be not from last night, the night before. There was a wave last night, 2 multiple launch rocket systems as well. 35 vehicles and fuel tanks, has a real uptick in that number, and that will have a significant impact on the Russian ability to do logistics, and 3 special piece of special equipment, so that will almost certainly be comms and whatnot. Before we go to look at Andrew Perpetua's list, which is impressive, I just want to have a talk about Russian losses and, by extension, Ukrainian losses. So we have had 4 main areas for the Ukrainians to attack, which is, the Velika Novosilka area over here, the Robotyne area there, the Vasilivka area, Piaty-Khatki there, and of course south of Bakhmut, where the Ukrainians have had some decent success. That's basically where the Ukrainians have been concentrating. The Russians have been trying to shore up their defenses in Bakhmut by piling in a whole load of forces into Bakhmut, and then really they were looking at these 3 areas and having the whole, at the beginning of the counteroffensive, the whole Zaporizhia front line would have had Russian forces spread along there waiting to see what the Ukrainians did. Then they attacked in those 3 places, so they piled their defenders into there. But then what happened is the Ukrainians started doing quite well in Robotyne. So we saw, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of these claims, but generally we saw the Russians bring in defenses from Kherson that has actually left the Kherson sector fairly much undermanned, and that was partly because the Novokakhovka dam flooded and they didn't see the need to keep the troops there, and there were pressing needs up here in Zaporizhia. So they brought more troops in there, and then the Ukrainians concentrated even more, and they started upping the pressure on Robotyne, and actually we started seeing them put less pressure on certain areas, like for example this Vasilivka area. So that was basically became a stalemate. They didn't have huge number of forces there anyway, but they kind of stopped working there. And then really Velika Novosilka area, they stopped working there and they started piling in more forces into this area, which was kind of what NATO asked them to do anyway. So we saw a much bigger focus on there. But at the same time, there was quite a bit of attrition to the Russian forces. So along with this, we saw the Russians then start to move troops down from Crimea area. We saw the VDV forces come all the way down to support this sector. We saw, both from the Crimea area, 25th Combined Arms Army came in to replace troops from the Russians that were then taken from even further north from Crimea to add to this area. And it was basically throwing in all of their reserves from everywhere here, locally, but also reserves pulled from other areas of the front line. And at the same time, you had the Ukrainians stopping in Velika Novosilka and pulling their own forces in from Velika Novosilka to Robotyne, which then allowed the Russians to maybe gain a little bit in Velika Novosilka, but apparently they are also bringing their forces from Velika Novosilka now into here. So we have just this entire bubbling cauldron of activity that is broadly not drawing from Bakhmut area, because that is its own thing, and the Russians really don't want to lose Bakhmut. But they are losing a lot of troops and they are losing a lot of equipment. Meanwhile, occasionally trying to do things to mess up this offensive by the Ukrainians still, like attacking recently in Makivka. There are claims that they are brewing for a big offensive in the northeastern sector. There are claims that they are doing it elsewhere as well. We've seen a couple of massive attacks coming in the Krasnohorivka area over here as well, where they lost huge amounts of vehicles, and indeed Uruzhaini here, where the Russians lost huge amounts of vehicles. So it's not just that it's all happening here. There are distractions going on elsewhere, but there is an awful lot taking place here. You could say, and Georgie said this yesterday, I think it was, that this is the Battle of Tokmak. They're not at Tokmak, but this is like a proxy Battle of Tokmak. So if we get rid of all of these scribbles, if Tokmak is down here, but all the fighting around here is stopping the fighting taking place here. And if it's all exhausted around here and the Ukrainians are able to march on, how much will the Russians have to defend Tokmak? So really, the Battle of Tokmak is taking place now, and the Russians are throwing everything at it. And then this translates into these kinds of losses where the Russians are throwing attacks back towards Ukraine as they are coming under pressure. So even in Verbove, they are counterattacking. There's lots of activity in the Kopane and to the west of Novoprokopivka around there. So they will be losing a lot, as well as all those other places, Makivka and Krasnohorivka and so on and so forth. So then when we look at what Andrew Perpetua, who scours the Russian sources to try and find Ukrainian losses so that he can't be accused of being biased, right? And he does a really good job of that. He says he looks at 2/3 Russian sources, 1/3 Ukrainian sources, and still figures like this. So this is a really significant day of losses. As you can see, the Ukrainians have lost very few bits of kit, and we're talking about a 5-to-1 ratio or more here. What have the Russians lost? Well, a lot of everything. Electronic warfare, comms equipments, only a few bits of artillery that he's found footage of, a lot of tanks lost, a lot of IFVs, a lot of trucks and civilian vehicles. So that's FPV drone footage responsible for all those civilian and trucks losses. When it comes to tanks, it's a mixture of drones, FPVs, artillery, mines, all sorts of things. Same with IFVs. And when we come to surveillance equipment, that's almost always FPV drones. An electronic warfare system like a Jitel, which isn't something like a stand with cameras on it. This is actually an expensive piece of equipment. That's why that's been hit with the Gimlers. You wouldn't use a Gimlers against these kind of surveillance unit, Muron M. These are just camera units that you often see FPV drones take out. So the losses are huge. Artillery isn't so much supported by footage that is out there, and I think that's because what's the point of loading 30 pieces of footage up there every day? Why are you wasting your time doing that? So there's a few bits will be shown, but as Andrew Perpetua said, there's a lot of drone operators who have a ton of footage in their pockets. Say, do you want to see, like he said, I have drone operators saying to me, do you want to see all this footage? And they'll have like 20 bits of footage that just isn't loaded up there, and each drone operator will have that. He's even said more than that, like hundreds. There is an awful lot of footage that isn't on the internet. So I think when you go back to these figures, they might not be 100% accurate, but they're in the ballpark, and it tells us a story, and that story is the Russians are losing a lot of equipment and men at the moment. It's not to say the Ukrainians aren't as well, but I think the Ukrainians are not losing anywhere near the amount of equipment. And then when you look at all the sources, as Andrew Perpetua does, Telegram, Twitter, here and there, then you get a picture that the ratios of Russian losses to Ukrainian losses are definitely in Ukrainian favor. Okay, the morning starts with great news, says a dead district. Russian source reports a very high number of wounded arriving at hospitals from the Bakhmut area. Wounded soldiers report heavy losses and dozens of soldiers surrendering, which is again something we are hearing from sources on the front line of Bakhmut. It is attritional for both sides in Bakhmut. However, the Russians are counterattacking, so they are treating their own forces in their very aggressive defense, but we're also seeing a lot of imagery of POWs being taken, and claims from the Russians that they are taking heavy losses in that area. Here, Russian source reports a very high number of wounded arriving at hospitals, heavy losses, dozens of soldiers surrendering. There are no details yet, but the morning we have unprecedented flow of injuries, presumably from near Bakhmut. It's not entirely clear what's happening there, but people arriving talking about heavy losses and several dozen Russian soldiers who have surrendered. So that gives you an idea of the front line. Now, we're going to speak quite a long time on a few particular things that happened that I think are morally repugnant. This will lead to discussions about Russian voices on my threads. I've done a members poll on my channel about this, but we'll get to that in a second. What are we talking about first? Well, another outrage. Russia with, well, actually 51 people, I think it's 52 now, killed in a rocket attack near Kupiansk and Kharkiv region. The missile hit a cafe and a grocery shop in the village of Groza. So this is just a random village, it seems, and there's absolutely no evidence that this is a bona fide target from the Russians at all. There's no military sort of target nearby. This is a grocery store here. In fact, it appears to be a cafe. It appears to be where a wake was taking place, as far as I can work out. Death toll in Grozia has increased to 49, said Tim White this last night. Another body was dragged from the rubble of the cafe. Rescuers in Kharkiv region continue to work. There are photos of tens of bodies beside the ruins of the shop and cafe. I could show you all sorts of footage, but it is inappropriate. There are a lot of dead bodies. There are people crying next to loved ones. It is horrific, right? I can't even show you the Euromaidan press. There's just this picture here is just dead bodies. Russian attack on grocery kills 51. It's now 52, including a child. Wounded 6 others, including a child. It is absolutely terrible. Yesterday, a funeral wake in a village of mostly elderly people. Today, randomly targeting residents in Ukraine's second biggest city, again with this kind of missile. So that is the wake taking place yesterday. And now today, Kharkiv has been hit with Iskanders. And the claim yesterday was Iskander as well. So this is a footage of the destruction the Iskander brought on that village, where that was a grocery and a cafe with lots of people inside, possibly having a wake, and 52 people now being dead from that. This is pretty despicable activity from the Russians, either way you look at it. Okay, so the number of dead in the village of Hroza has increased to, well, brackets 52, according to the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, Ihor Klimenko. Debris removal continues. A 3-day mourning period has been declared in Kharkiv region. Zelensky reacted to the Russian strike on Hroza in Kharkiv. Quote, "This was a completely deliberate, demonstrative and brutal terrorist act. So far, 51 people have been reported dead. My condolences to everyone who lost their relatives. The wounded are being treated. Russian terror must be stopped. All those who help Russia circumvent sanctions are criminals. Those who continue to support Russia are supporting evil." This is my point about people commenting in my threads, where I have my usual suspects, Clive Engels, Solid Foe Live, any of these people that spout their Trevor Shea, that spout their pro-Kremlin narratives, are supporting evil. And I've got to a point where I don't know that I want evil to be supported in my thread. You know, go and crap on your own lawn. Don't come around my place and crap on my lawn. right? I don't want you there to do that. It's disgusting, right? You are disgusting individuals if you support this kind of activity. Don't give me Donbass shelling and that nonsense in 2014 onwards that it's just Russian talking points. Don't give me that, because it doesn't wash with me, right? I'll hit back with much better argumentation than that. This is unacceptable, and if you support this, you are unacceptable. And I don't really want unacceptable, morally abhorrent people hanging around my place. You know, I don't invite. Yeah, you've got freedom of speech, but if you're a mass murderer and you're going to come around my house and start advocating for mass murder, yeah, you've got the freedom to do that. You've got the freedom to say that. I don't want to hear it here, so you can jog on. That's the point I've got to. So I've put a poll out to my members, say, what do you think about this? Like, should we accept people spreading lies and hate, or should I tell them to jog on? And then all the arguments about freedom of speech. So I'm going to actually talk about this in my extra today, because I think there's some great comments from you guys, from the members on the threads there, and I think it's worthy of a good old philosophical debate. That anyway. So Russia has condemned. Oh, did I even finish that? No, I didn't. So he continued. Russia needs these and similar terror attacks for one reason only: to make its genocidal aggression the new norm for the world. And I thank every leader in every nation who supports us in defense of life. Right now, European leaders and I are focused on, in particular, on how to strengthen our air defenses, strengthen our troops, and protect our country from terror. So he's been in Europe trying to sort that out. So Russia is condemned over horrifying strike on a Ukraine village that killed more than 50. This is just from The Guardian today. So Ukrainian President Zelensky said it was no blind strike. He described it on Telegram as a demonstrably brutal Russian crime, a rocket attack on an ordinary grocery store, a completely deliberate act of terrorism, as we heard. So my condolences to all those who have lost loved ones. My son was just found without a head, without arms, without legs, without anything. They recognized him from his documents, Vladimir Mukhovati, 70, told Agence France Presse. I'll just repeat that. My son was found without a head, without arms, without legs, without anything. Only recognizable by his documents. His wife and daughter-in-law were also attending the wake, and although he had little hope of finding them alive, he watched rescue workers from a distance just in case. I lived for my wife for 48 years, he said. I will not last long alone. Denise Brown, Ukraine coordinator for the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, called the attack absolutely horrifying, and that intentionally directing an attack against civilians or civilian objects is a war crime. The attack was the deadliest in Kharkiv region since Russia's invasion more than 19 months ago, a regional official told public broadcaster Susplin. It also appeared to be one of the biggest civilian death tolls in any single Russian strike. Quote, a deliberate missile strike on a village in Kharkiv region on an ordinary store and cafe, Zelensky said in the nightly video address delivered while attending a summit of the European political community in Spain. Russian troops could not have been unaware of where they were hitting. This was no blind strike. So they knew what they were hitting. They would have been aware of this. Moscow did not immediately comment on the events in Hroza. Moscow denies deliberately targeting civilians, but many have been killed in attacks that have hit residential areas, as well as energy, defense, port, grain, and other facilities. Hroza is located more than 30 kilometers from the frontline town of Kupiansk, in an area where the Russian forces have been pushing to recapture territory they lost in Ukrainian troops last year. Klimenko, the minister, said initial evidence showed an Iskander missile being used. Zelensky said a 6-year-old boy was among the dead, and regional officials said families had remained in the village despite a wartime order to evacuate. Rescue workers made their way through mounds of debris and laid out bodies in a field next to a children's playground. Some were placed in work body bags and taken away. Others were barely covered by carpets or other materials. Right. There is no excuse for Russia, because they can't even say it was a military target, because the body, I've seen the bodies. Those are not military bodies. This was not a military strike. This was a strike on civilians. This is horrific. This is a war crime. You cannot justify this. Right, Russia-Ukraine war live. This is the live feed from The Guardian. US condemns horrifying attack on Kharkiv village. So, death toll rises to 52 after a Russian attack on Ukrainian village. A missile slammed into a cafe and grocery store on the village on Thursday. 52 people died as a result of the missile attack. Okay, people are still in hospitals. The injuries are quite serious. I just wanted to read this. This is the White House spokesperson, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. She said, let's stop and think about what we're seeing. 49 now, 52 innocent people who are killed by a Russian airstrike while they were shopping for food at a supermarket. That's what they were doing. Can you imagine just walking to the grocery store with your kids, trying to figure out what it was that you're going to make for dinner, and you see an explosion happen where bodies are everywhere, and it's horrifying. This is why we're doing everything that we can to help Ukraine, to help the brave people of Ukraine to fight for their freedom, to fight for their democracy. Right. We can easily forget this, and we do. You forget what's happened at Dnipropetrovsk, where an anti-ship missile slammed into the building. You forget what happened in Kramatorsk at the railway station back towards the beginning of the war. This is freaking disgusting, right? And it's happening time and time again. And we're dithering about ATACMS and Taurus and this and that. Just bloody give them everything. And the Ukrainians have to prevail. The Russians cannot win. This kind of disgusting behavior cannot be countenanced by the international community. As Andrew Perpetua says, 330 people live in Groza, 51 died. Almost 1 in 7 people died today in that village. To an Iskander, Russian terrorism. Europe needs to wake the F up and start sending more weapons to stop this war. Their cowardice is escalating Russian terrorism, and I think he's particularly talking about Taurus there. It's not great at all, obviously. And then today, as if like that wasn't bad enough, in the morning, Russia launched 2 missile strikes on the civilian infrastructure in Kharkiv. They just slammed 2 missiles into buildings in Kharkiv. In particular, they hit a residential building. There's currently 1 dead, a 10-year-old boy who's dead, 16 wounded, including an 11-month-old child. Words have failed me just then. I am bloody angry. This is what the Russians are doing.
С добрым и гулять утром. Пиздец. Охереть. С добрым и гулять утром.
That's what Russia are doing. Here it is from a different angle. You can see just fire there. Her own windows have fallen in. Disgusting. Man, I hate what Russia is doing. Here, central district of Kharkiv, after an attack of a Russian Iskander missile. 2 apartment buildings were damaged, another residential building was destroyed. 1 10-year-old boy was found dead under the rubble. 16 more were injured. I mean, I'm showing you all this. I won't, I get restricted for this. I'll release this video irrespective because, you need to see this. I mean, if this stuff doesn't make you angry, you have no heart. And then this is on the back of yesterday, the Russians targeting a hospital in Berislav. The 4th floor of the entire 4th floor of a hospital was destroyed. Dozens of casualties. I mean, there are differing claims about what's happened, but that's a hospital. That's an FAB 500 or similar bomb smacking in to the top of a hospital. Just unacceptable. It's unacceptable. Of course it's unacceptable. So that's 3 incidents in sort of 24, 36 hours that are just absolutely not okay. Doing that to a hospital is not okay. Russia has formed. They've done it to about 700 medical institutions, I think, over the course of this war. They did it in Syria, where they were given the coordinates of hospitals and asked by the International Red Cross, I think it was, or was it Médecins Sans Frontières, or maybe a number of different institutions, saying, here are the coordinates for all the hospitals. Please don't hit the Syrian hospitals because this is humanitarian. And the Russians went out and hit all of those hospitals that they were given the coordinates for. That's what Russia do. So it's, you know, at times like this, you could say, oh, it could be a mistake. They could be aiming for something else. They've got form for particularly hitting medical establishments. That is utterly unacceptable. So I get to the point where if you're going to come onto my threads and somehow justify this because Ukraine Nazis or something, you can frick off. I'm that angry today, and I just find anyone that attempts to justify this or to say there should be peace. I'll tell you how you get peace. These guys should be stopped from doing this. It's the peace is on them. It's not on the victims. There's not victim blame here. It's on the Russians. So I don't have time for anyone justifying these horrors. So, Andrew Perpetually said, I posted an earlier map update today than usual. Frontline-wise, I see no changes. All the news beyond that is bad news. And the bad news isn't like frontline Ukrainians losing territory. The bad news is Russia blowing up a hospital in Beryslav with 2 guided bombs, shot an Iskander that killed 50-plus civilians in Hroza, Kharkiv, and launched a large number of airstrikes and missile strikes, just pure terrorism. And that was before this morning's attack on Kharkiv, where they sent missiles into Kharkiv. And when you get onto these kind of airstrikes, the Russians have the freedom to drop these FAB 500s by flying within this orange zone. And they're pretty much safe to do so. This is why I think it's so important to get Patriots near the front line. I know some people disagree with that. If you protect the hell out of Patriots and put them near the front line, this stops happening. And there is news actually that they're getting another Patriot today from Germany. So that's really good news. Right, on to strikes in general. Overnight, the Russians hit Ukraine with 33 Shahed drones. 25 got shot down. So 8 out of 33. That's about a quarter. So I guess 75% interception rate, which is fairly good. But obviously that's 8 drones getting through and doing damage. And indeed, it seems that they did most of their damage around, what are they doing this time? Oh, yeah, hitting international food supplies. So Russia targeted the port and border infrastructure of the Danube, and granaries, administrative buildings and freight vehicles were damaged. Are they military targets? No. Is that food for the rest of the world? Yes. Is Russia attacking the world's ability, Africans' ability to eat food? Yes. Are the Russians committing war crimes? Yes. Should we defend what the Russians do at all? No, because you would be evil. Prosecutor's office of the Odessa region posted those photos. 9 trucks damaged, grain storage, administration buildings. Okay, what the Ukrainians done in their own drone attacks this evening, Kursk region started again with explosions. So the Ukrainians are doing this. Are they hitting civilians? Are they hitting food storage? No. Are they sending missiles directly into apartment buildings? No. They are prosecuting a war that's far more on the side of international legality. And actually, I've listened to a few sort of analyses on this, and yeah. Anyway, moving on from distant strikes. Before I get myself too angry, this is the poll that I've done, and I will talk about this. Some people might say, "Oh, it's a loaded question." They should be allowed to spread their lies and hate here on my threads. This is not the place for their lies and hate. I support a ban. You might say it's a loaded question, the lies and hate. No, that's what I'm talking about. If they're giving me lies and hate, yeah, so it's not really a loaded question. Or tough one, I can see arguments on both going both ways here. Don't know. 77% of people say that they should be banned if they're doing that. Again, the question is if they're doing that. But actually, there are good points either way on this, and lots of people giving your opinions. I really, really value you guys' opinions. I will be talking about this more from a philosophical point of view. I've done the whole freedom of speech a number of times. I'll just revisit it a little bit with regards to that. Okay, last thing I'm going to say, because it's been a long one. Russian artillery shell funnel. This is really... I could do this on the military aid section, but we'll do it here. A really good analysis. I saw Georgie use this last night. Georgie from Ukraine Matters. This is a great infographic. Take it with a pinch of salt. Let's have a look at the shell usage and manufacture for both sides. So shells, from what I understand from this, the Russians had 20 million shells to start with. I don't know what the difference between the gross and the net starts. So maybe they started with 15 million, maybe 5 million and were duff or something. I don't know. Okay, so 15 million start, and then they used 11 million in 2022, which equates to about 30,000 a day. There were different levels within 2022, and we'll look at that. So 30,000 a day. They made 1 million shells in 2022, and then in 2023 they used 5.8 million. So you can say 15 million take away 11 is 4 million, plus 1 is 5 million. They use 5.8 million this year, which means that they've got minus 800,000, which is impossible. Oh no, because they've been making them. They made 1.5 million, which means they've got 700,000 left. That's his analysis. Okay, so a couple of things to note here. 11 million used in last year is now down to 5.8 million. So that's basically, they are using half the shells. So 30,000 to 16,000 a day. They're using half the shells now that they were last year. So that's significant. They've upped their manufacture, but their manufacture is nowhere near what they need in terms of what they use on a daily basis. So on a daily basis, at 16,000 a day, that is 1.5 mil doesn't cut it. So now they're down to a stock of 0.7 mil. They can only really use artillery at the rate they are producing it, which is, not nearly enough. So they will use, if they're making 1.5 million in a year, then they can't shoot 16,000 from now on. 16,000 is as a result of having a stock of 5.8 million plus what they've made, right? So now they should be down to a very minimal number of shells they can fire. So we see per day split into quarters. They were firing 63,000 per day in the first quarter of 2022. He's actually revised that. Says it. I think it was Ukraine had higher. Then he said actually they had many more stocks there and used more, and then it went right down. So, but anyway, 63,000, 57, 40,000, 20,000. Quarter 4 in 2022. It went up in quarter 1 in 2023, probably due to Bakhmut and whatnot. Maybe getting some from North Korea, I don't know. And then it went down to 20,000, 12,000. And the estimate for the quarter that we're in now, November, so October, November, December, is 7,000. Now, 7,000 is less than what the Ukrainians have been firing at certain points. And in fact, if you look at the Ukrainian stats here, 4,000, 5,000, 7,000, 5,000, 7,000, 4,000, 8,000. So the last quarter, the counter-offensive quarter where they're stockpiled, you can see it dropped to 4,000. And I talked about this, that I don't think they were all complaining about shell hunger, and they're complaining about shell hunger in that quarter because they were receiving the same amounts of shells, but they were just keeping them back for the counter-offensive, which is exactly what the stats appear to show here. So using 8,000 in the counter-offensive is the highest that they've used, still nowhere near what the Russians have used. And then a 9,000 estimate per day estimate for this quarter we're in now would be more than the Russians would be sending in. It does a breakdown, looks at different sources here. This is a really good analysis. And you can see there 11 million used last year. Then they made 1 million, so they're back up to here. Then they used 5.8 million and they made 1.5 million, so they're back up to here, and that leaves them with 0.7 million. And if you want to see it as a line graph, there you go. And we're now at a point where the Ukrainians are using more artillery than the Russians, artillery ammunition. And you have the ramping up of artillery ammunition production throughout the world that will better support that even more. So although you're probably not going to get up to Russian levels from earlier in the war, like 40,000, 60,000 shells a day, you are going to get to a sustainable, decent amount of shell usage for the Ukrainians that will be better than they have had it, and arguably better than the Russians. And if that asymmetry is sustainable, then that is a massive advantage, because actually the Ukrainians are much more accurate with their shells. So if they're firing, say, 15,000 shells to the Russians, I don't know, 6,000 shells, say it ends up something like that, which is amazing. They're firing double the amount of the Russians. I'm assuming best case scenario here. Then, and it's not just that they've got more shells, it's their shells are more accurate. You have cluster munitions, you have Excalibur, precision guided munitions, and you have smart munitions as well. So these are better munitions fired from longer range, more accurate artillery that are better maintained. The barrels are in better shape, so everything is better here. So you might have double the amount of shells, but it might be a magnifier of like ×2 in terms of accuracy. So it might be the equivalent of having 4 times the shells or more. I think this is really significant, and I hope this is accurate data that kind of bears out. Anyway, let me know what you think. That's a lot of me talking. Take care, everybody. I'll speak soon.